"There's a seat for you over there," my stepmother mocked, moving my chair away during Christmas dinner. I calmly placed a brown folder on the table. When they read the original deed and realized the house was mine, they froze, in shock. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." For a few seconds, nobody reached for their food. The only sound in the room was soft Christmas music playing somewhere behind us. My stepmother, Patricia, stood beside the dining table with one hand resting on the chair she'd just dragged away. She smiled. Not a warm smile. "There," she said, pointing toward a folding chair beside the china cabinet. "That should be more comfortable." A couple of relatives let out awkward little chuckles. No one looked directly at me. I looked at the folding chair, then at the table where everyone else already had a proper seat. It wasn't the first time. I picked up my brown folder, walked over without arguing, and set it on the table before sitting down. "I'll stay right here," I said calmly. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "As long as you understand where your place is?" I nodded. "Oh, I do." She seemed satisfied with that answer. She had no idea what I actually meant. "My name is Elena Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until that Christmas Eve, I believed I understood my place in this family. I thought I was the extra child. The reminder of my father's first marriage. It took years to stop asking why I was treated differently. Eventually, pretending not to notice became easier than hoping things would change. Around the table, everyone returned to their conversations. My aunt complimented the turkey. Someone asked about football. My cousin laughed over a story from work. The room moved on almost instantly. Like watching me get pushed aside had become another Christmas tradition. Across the table, my stepsister Vanessa caught my eye. She smirked before taking another sip of wine. She never had to say much. Patricia always did the talking for her. My father sat at the end of the table. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. He slowly turned his water glass without taking a drink. For one brief moment, our eyes met. I waited. Maybe he'd tell Patricia to stop. Instead, he looked down again. That hurt more than anything Patricia had said. Ryan, my younger stepbrother, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. When no one was looking, he gave me the smallest shake of his head. It wasn't agreement. It was an apology. I gave him a tiny smile. I didn't blame him anymore. Patricia clapped her hands. "Now that everyone's settled, let's enjoy dinner before it gets cold." Plates began moving around the table. Someone asked if I was still working at the rehabilitation center. "I am." "Busy helping strangers?" Vanessa asked with a laugh. "Mostly helping people get back on their feet." "That's nice," Patricia cut in. "You've always liked taking care of other people's problems." Most people would have heard a compliment. I heard the insult underneath. An uncle asked if I was seeing anyone. Before I could answer, Patricia laughed. "Elena's always so busy. She never really stays anywhere long enough." A few relatives laughed politely. Ryan quietly stared at his plate. I rested one hand on the brown folder beside me. I hadn't let it leave my side all evening. Patricia noticed. "What's in the folder?" "Just some paperwork." She shrugged. "Christmas can wait until after business." "You're right," I said. "It can." I slowly looked around the dining room. The same fireplace. The same family photos. The same house where I'd spent almost my entire life feeling like an unwanted guest. Everyone at that table still believed this house belonged to them. I folded my hands over the brown folder and let the conversation continue. None of them realized they were about to learn otherwise. I kept my hand resting on the brown folder while everyone around me talked about holiday plans, recipes, and football scores, like nothing unusual had happened. Funny how people can pretend not to notice the person sitting just a few feet away. I got used to that years ago. I wasn't always this calm. When I was younger, I used to wonder what I had done wrong. I'd replay conversations in my head for days, trying to figure out why everything felt easier for everyone else in the family. Eventually, I stopped asking. Not because I found the answer, because no one was ever willing to give me one. I should probably tell you a little about myself. My name is Elena Carter. I'm 34 years old and I work as a rehabilitation therapist. Most of my days are spent helping older adults recover after strokes, surgeries, or serious injuries. It's work that requires patience. Some people need weeks before they trust you enough to take a single step. Others pretend they're stronger than they really are because they're embarrassed to ask for help. I've always understood that. Maybe because I've been pretending to be stronger than I felt for most of my life. One of my favorite patients, Mr. Henderson, liked to joke that healing wasn't about walking again. It's about believing tomorrow is worth getting out of bed for, he'd tell everyone in the therapy room. I'd smile every time he said it. Then I'd drive home to a family where nobody really asked how my day had gone. The strange part wasn't that they hated me. Hatred is loud. What I lived with was much quieter. I was simply less important. If Vanessa got promoted at work, Patricia organized a family dinner. When I earned a professional certification after months of studying, my father looked up from the newspaper and said, "That's good." Then he went back to reading. That was the entire conversation. I told myself it didn't matter. I was an adult. I had my own apartment, my own career, my own life. People don't need constant approval forever. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Every Christmas, every birthday, every family gathering, I lowered my expectations a little more. It made disappointments easier to carry. Ryan noticed, though. He never said much, but he'd find small ways to include me. He'd save me the last slice of pie before Vanessa could grab it. He'd text me after family dinners. "You okay?" Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind me someone had noticed. Sometimes those little things matter more than grand speeches. Even my father seemed different whenever Patricia wasn't around. If we happened to be alone for a few minutes, he'd ask about work. He'd ask whether I was sleeping enough, whether business at the clinic was busy. The conversations never lasted long. As soon as Patricia walked into the room, he became quieter, like someone had flipped a switch. For years, I convinced myself that was just his personality. Quiet, passive, conflict avoidant. I made excuses for him because it was easier than admitting he kept choosing silence. If you've ever been in a family where one person quietly controls the mood, you'll probably understand exactly what I mean. And if this story reminds you of someone you've known, let me know in the comments. I'm always surprised by how many people recognize these little moments. Looking back now, there were signs everywhere. Tiny things. The way conversation stopped when I entered a room. The way Patricia answered questions that were directed at my father. The way everyone acted as though that was completely normal. I accepted all of it because I believed one simple thing. I believed I understood why my childhood had been different. It wasn't a happy explanation, but it made enough sense that I stopped looking any deeper. I spent almost 30 years believing I was treated differently because I was the daughter from my father's first marriage. That seemed like the whole story. It turned out, it wasn't even close. Nobody ever came right out and said I wasn't part of the family. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it showed up in little routines that became so normal, I stopped noticing them until I was much older. Patricia had a way of making everything sound reasonable. If Vanessa wanted to invite friends over, the living room suddenly became the perfect place to entertain. If I wanted to have a classmate over, Patricia would smile and say, "Maybe another time. The house is a mess." Funny thing was, the house never looked any different. At dinner, Vanessa got asked about school, sports, and whatever new hobby she was trying that month. When it was my turn, the questions were shorter. "Everything okay?" "Yep." Good. That was usually enough for everyone. I learned not to expect anyone to ask a second question. Birthdays weren't exactly unfair. They were just different. Vanessa usually got the celebration she wanted: decorations, a homemade cake, pictures, relatives staying longer than usual. Mine were quieter. There was always a cake, always a gift. Nothing anyone could point to and call neglect. But there was never much excitement. It felt more like checking something off a list. Even as a teenager, I could tell the difference. When Vanessa got her driver's license, Patricia told everyone at church how proud she was. She repeated the story for weeks. A year later, I graduated near the top of my class. Dad shook my hand. Patricia smiled politely. Dinner went on like any other evening. Nobody even asked how graduation had gone. I remember standing in my room afterward, still wearing my graduation clothes, wondering if maybe I expected too much. So I lowered my expectations. When I earned a scholarship, I celebrated with friends instead of family. When I finished college, I invited coworkers to dinner instead of asking whether anyone at home wanted to come. By the time I started my career, sharing good news with my family felt unnecessary. Not because I wanted to punish them, because I already knew how those conversations ended. Ryan noticed before anyone else did. One afternoon, he texted me after I'd posted a picture from work receiving an award. "Why didn't you tell us?" I answered honestly. "I didn't think anyone would care." A few minutes later, he replied, "I would've." I stared at that message for a long time. It didn't erase everything, but it reminded me that not everyone in that house saw me the same way. Dad even called that evening. "I heard you got recognized at work." I did. "That's really good, Elena." There was an awkward silence. "Thanks." Neither of us knew what else to say. He wanted to sound supportive. I wanted to believe him. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Looking back, I think we both knew something had been broken long before either of us admitted it. The strange part is that I never thought Patricia wanted to hurt me. Control? Yes. Approval? Definitely. But she preferred quiet comparisons over open arguments. She didn't have to insult me. She only had to make sure Vanessa always stood a little taller. Eventually, everyone accepted that as normal, including me. There was one memory, though, that kept coming back no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. I was around 12 when I noticed an old framed photograph sitting on a shelf in the hallway. It showed my father smiling beside a woman I barely recognized at first. Then I realized it was my mother. I remember stopping to look at it before school. That afternoon, the picture was gone. I asked Patricia where it had gone. She barely looked up from folding laundry. "It was old," she said. "I packed it away." "Where?" "You don't need to worry about boxes full of old memories." I looked toward my father, hoping he'd say something. He kept reading the newspaper. Years passed, and I almost forgot that photograph had ever existed. Almost. Because once I started thinking about it again, one question refused to leave me. Why was my mother almost nowhere to be found in the house where she'd once lived? That missing photograph stayed in the back of my mind for years, not because I remembered my mother very clearly. I didn't. She passed away when I was still little, and most of my memories were scattered pieces. A laugh I couldn't quite hear anymore. The smell of a sweater. A pair of warm hands fixing my jacket before we went outside. That was about it. So whenever I wanted to know more about her, I asked the people who should have known her best. The answers never lasted very long. One Saturday afternoon, I found my father cleaning out a shelf in the garage. There were old photo albums stacked inside a dusty cardboard box. "Can I look through these?" I asked. He smiled a little. "Sure." I sat on the floor flipping through page after page. There were pictures from family vacations, birthday parties, school events. Then I noticed something strange. Most of the earliest pages had empty spaces where photographs had obviously been removed. The corners were still there. The pictures weren't. Who took these out? Dad looked over for a second. I'm not sure. He answered too quickly. Before I could ask another question, Patricia walked into the garage carrying a basket of laundry. "What are you two doing?" "Just looking through old albums," I said. She barely glanced at them. "Those things collect dust more than memories." Then she picked up the album from my lap and closed it. "Come help me set the table instead." That was the end of the conversation. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe the missing pictures had fallen out. Maybe someone borrowed them years ago. There had to be a simple explanation. But little moments kept adding up. Whenever relatives visited and started talking about the early years of my parents' marriage, Patricia somehow redirected the conversation. "Oh, that reminds me." Then she'd ask about someone's new job, or a vacation, or dessert. Within seconds, everyone had moved on. Even when people mentioned my mother by name, it never lasted. Her name would appear, then disappear just as quickly. One Thanksgiving, my aunt smiled at me and said, "You know, your mother used to make—" Patricia interrupted before she finished. "Who's ready for pie?" The whole table shifted to a different conversation. I remember looking at my aunt. She looked just as surprised as I felt. Nobody went back to what she'd been about to say. Not even Dad. That bothered me more than Patricia changing the subject. Dad had been there. He could have answered. Instead, he'd take another bite of food or reach for his drink like he hadn't heard anything. I started watching him more closely after that. Whenever my mother's name came up, his shoulders stiffened. His smile disappeared. Sometimes he'd rub the side of his wedding ring without realizing he was doing it. Other times he'd suddenly find an excuse to leave the room. For years, I thought he was simply grieving. Losing someone changes people. I saw that every day through my patients and their families. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. Still, something about his silence felt different. It wasn't just sadness. It looked more like discomfort. Almost like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Ryan noticed me paying attention. One evening, he stopped by my apartment to return a ladder he'd borrowed. We ended up sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee while the sun went down. He asked, "You've been asking a lot about your mom lately." "I guess I have." "You remember much about her?" "Not really. That's kind of the problem." He nodded slowly. "I wish I could help." For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then he shrugged like he'd just remembered something. "You know." "What?" "Dad gets weird whenever your mom comes up." He said it so casually that I don't think he realized what he'd admitted. I looked at him. "Weird how?" Ryan frowned, suddenly realizing he'd said more than he meant to. He stared into his coffee instead of answering. Ryan looked up a few seconds later and forced a small smile. "I probably shouldn't have said that." "Why not?" He shrugged. "I don't know, it just always changes the mood." That answer stayed with me. Not because it explained anything, because it didn't. A few weeks later, Dad invited everyone over for Sunday lunch. Nothing special, just the usual family meal where Patricia made enough food for twice as many people, and Vanessa spent most of the afternoon talking about work. I almost didn't go, but Ryan texted me that morning. "You should come. Dad's been asking if you'll be there." So I did. For the first hour, everything felt surprisingly normal. Dad asked about one of my patients who had recently learned to walk again after surgery. Vanessa complained about a difficult client. Ryan joked about burning dinner the night before. Even Patricia seemed unusually pleasant. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined some of the distance between us. Then I noticed an old Christmas ornament hanging in the dining room. It had my mother's initials painted across the bottom. MC. I picked it up carefully. I don't remember seeing this before. Dad glanced over from the kitchen. His face softened. Your mother bought that during our first Christmas together. It was the first spontaneous thing I'd ever heard him say about her. I smiled. What was she like at Christmas? He actually looked like he was about to answer. A real answer. The kind I'd been hoping to hear for years. Patricia walked in carrying a bowl of potatoes. Oh goodness, who wants extra gravy? Nobody had even asked for gravy. The conversation disappeared instantly. Dad looked down at the counter. I waited another few seconds. So, what were you saying? He rubbed his hands together. It doesn't matter. I'd actually like to know. Patricia set the bowl down a little harder than necessary. Elena, sweetheart, there's no reason to live in the past. I'm not living in the past. I just asked what my mother was like. Patricia laughed lightly as if I were being dramatic. You know what memories do? They keep people from appreciating what they have today. Vanessa nodded without even looking up from her phone. She's right. I looked at Dad. He still hadn't said a word. Not one. Lunch continued, but something had shifted. The conversations felt forced now. Everyone seemed careful about what they said. Even Ryan barely spoke. Later, while Patricia and Vanessa cleaned the kitchen, I found Dad alone on the back porch. He was watching birds gather around the feeder he'd built years earlier. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Can I ask you something? He nodded. You've never really talked about Mom. He let out a slow breath. No, I haven't. Why? For several seconds he said nothing. The wind rattled the bare branches above us. Finally, he looked at me. Your mother was... He stopped. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen window. Patricia was standing inside. She wasn't saying anything. She was simply watching us. Dad swallowed. Then whatever he'd been about to say disappeared. I should go help inside. He brushed past me before I could answer. Dad. He paused, but didn't turn around. We'll talk another time. I watched him walk back into the house. The porch suddenly felt much colder than it had a minute earlier. For years, I'd believed my father stayed quiet because talking about my mother hurt too much. Standing there alone, I started wondering if that had never been the real reason at all. Life settled back into its usual routine for a while. I threw myself into work. Most days started before sunrise and ended with paperwork. I promised myself I'd finish before bed. My patients kept me busy enough that I wasn't constantly thinking about family. Then one afternoon, my phone rang in the middle of a therapy session break. It was Ryan. His voice sounded rushed. Elena, don't panic, but Dad had some chest pain this morning. My stomach tightened. Is he okay? They're saying it's not a heart attack. Just a minor cardiac episode. They're keeping him overnight for observation. I'll be there. By the time I reached the hospital, Dad was sitting up in bed looking more embarrassed than sick. I told everyone not to make a big deal out of this, he muttered. Ryan laughed. Yeah, well, nobody listened. Even Patricia looked shaken. She thanked the nurse 3 different times before the woman left the room. For a little while, all the usual family tension disappeared. We were just worried about Dad. The doctor explained that he needed to reduce stress, keep up with his medications, and stay on top of follow-up appointments. Dad nodded through the entire conversation. The moment the doctor left, he looked at me. Can you help me keep all this straight? I smiled. Of course. That wasn't unusual. Whenever something practical came up, somehow it always became my job. Medical appointments, insurance forms, taxes, technology. If someone needed patience and organization, they called me. If someone wanted company for holidays or celebrations, not so much. A few days after Dad came home, I stopped by the house with a binder and a stack of labeled folders. Ryan opened the front door. I had a feeling you'd turn this into a whole filing system. I know your father. He laughed. You definitely do. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, prescription receipts, insurance statements, appointment reminders, everything mixed together in one messy pile. I think I made it worse, he admitted. You definitely did. He smiled. It was small, but genuine. For the next hour, we sorted everything into separate folders: medical records, insurance, bank statements, household bills. Every now and then, Dad would remember another document and disappear into a hallway closet or an old cabinet. Didn't know we had this, he'd mumble before handing me another envelope. Patricia walked through the kitchen once or twice, but mostly stayed out of the way. That surprised me. Normally, she'd have an opinion about how everything should be done. This time, she barely said a word. Maybe she was still worried about Dad. Maybe she was simply exhausted. Around lunchtime, Ryan left to pick up sandwiches. Patricia went outside to answer a phone call. For the first time in years, Dad and I were alone in the house. It felt peaceful. He leaned back in his chair. I appreciate this, Elena. You don't have to thank me. I do. He looked around at the organized folders. I don't know what I'd do without you. I looked at him for a second. Those weren't words I heard very often. You're my dad, I said quietly. This is what family does. His expression changed, almost like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he simply nodded. There's one more insurance folder somewhere. He stood up slowly and disappeared into the hallway. A minute later, he returned carrying an old accordion file covered in dust. I haven't opened this thing in years. We both laughed. I guess today's the day. He set it on the table and I began sorting through faded policies and expired paperwork. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Old car insurance, homeowners' policies, medical statements from years ago. Nothing important. I reached the bottom of the folder and lifted one last packet. Something tucked behind it slipped free. A sealed cream-colored envelope slid onto the table between us. Dad's smile disappeared. Neither of us said a word as our eyes settled on the words written across the front. The envelope rested between us for only a second. That was all it took for me to read the words printed across the front. Carter Legacy Trust. I frowned. I've never heard of that. Before I could reach for it, Dad grabbed the envelope so quickly it almost slipped from his hands. The movement surprised both of us. He stared at me for a moment, then looked down at the envelope like he wished it had never fallen out. What is it? I asked. It's nothing. His answer came too fast. It doesn't look like nothing. He forced a small laugh. Just old paperwork. I had spent enough years dealing with patients to recognize when someone was uncomfortable. People avoided eye contact. Their voices changed. They answered questions they hadn't actually been asked. Dad was doing all three. I can file it with everything else, I offered. No. The word came out much sharper than either of us expected. He took a slow breath. I mean, that's okay. I'll keep this one. He slipped the envelope under another stack of papers. His hands weren't steady anymore. I watched him carefully. Dad? It's not important. You've never hidden paperwork from me before. I said it's nothing. The room fell quiet. A minute earlier, we'd been joking about his messy filing system. Now he wouldn't even look at me. Ryan walked back into the kitchen carrying a paper bag full of sandwiches. Hope everybody's hungry. He stopped when he noticed the silence. Everything okay? Dad answered before I could. Everything's fine. Ryan looked from him to me. Neither of us said anything. He slowly set the food on the counter. Patricia came in a few seconds later, still holding her phone. What did I miss? Dad immediately stood up. Nothing. Again. Too quickly. Too firmly. Patricia glanced toward the table. For just a split second, her eyes landed on the cream-colored envelope Dad was trying to slide into the accordion file. Her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. She walked over and closed the file herself. "There," she said with a smile. "No more paperwork today." It felt less like a suggestion, and more like an instruction. Nobody mentioned the envelope again during lunch. Ryan tried making conversation. Vanessa called to check on Dad. Patricia talked about grocery shopping. I answered when people spoke to me, but my attention kept drifting back to the accordion file sitting beside Dad's chair. I'd never seen him protect a document like that. Not even medical records after his heart scare. When I finally gathered my things to leave, Dad walked me to the front door. He'd always done that. It was one of the few habits that hadn't changed over the years. Outside, I turned toward him. "So, Carter Legacy Trust." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You really don't remember hearing about it?" "I've never heard those words before in my life." He looked past me toward the driveway instead of meeting my eyes. "It was something from a long time ago." "Related to Mom?" His jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he was actually going to answer. Instead, he shook his head. "You don't need to worry about it." I didn't move. "If it's connected to our family, why wouldn't I?" He looked tired. Older than he had even a week earlier. Finally, he placed one hand on the doorframe and spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "That document?" He hesitated. "Doesn't matter anymore." Then he stepped back inside and closed the door before I could ask another question. I couldn't get the words Carter Legacy Trust out of my head. They followed me to work. While I was helping patients through their therapy exercises, I'd catch myself replaying my father's reaction over and over. It wasn't the envelope itself that bothered me. It was the fear on his face. I'd never seen him react like that, not even after his heart scare. A few days later, I decided not to accuse anyone or jump to conclusions. I just started asking simple questions, the kind that shouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. I called Dad first. "Hey," I said, "I was thinking about that trust document." There was a pause. "I told you it was old paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" "I honestly don't remember." That answer didn't match what I'd seen. People don't snatch away documents they don't remember. Before I could ask anything else, he cleared his throat. "I've got another call coming in. We'll talk later." He never called back. A few evenings later, I stopped by the house to drop off some prescription refills for him. Patricia answered the door. "Oh, perfect timing," she said. "Come in." She seemed unusually cheerful. Too cheerful. Dad was upstairs resting, so the two of us ended up alone in the kitchen. I kept my tone casual. "I've been wondering about something." She smiled. "That's usually dangerous." "The Carter Legacy Trust." For the first time since I'd arrived, her smile disappeared. Only for a second. Then it came right back. "Oh, that. So, you know what it is?" She waved a hand as if brushing away a fly. "It was some outdated financial planning your father looked into years ago." "For who?" I honestly couldn't tell you. That was interesting. Dad had said he barely remembered it. Patricia acted like she knew exactly what it was. Until I asked one more question. "Was my mother involved?" She reached for a coffee mug before answering. "I don't remember." The conversation ended there. Not because I stopped asking, because she suddenly became very interested in loading the dishwasher. The timing felt a little too convenient. A week later, Vanessa invited me to meet her for coffee. That almost never happened, so I accepted. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about work, Ryan, and Dad's recovery. Then I casually brought it up. "Have you ever heard of the Carter Legacy Trust?" Vanessa frowned. "Is that some kind of investment account?" "I thought maybe you'd know." She laughed. "No. Dad handled all that boring stuff." That caught my attention. Patricia had called it financial planning. Dad barely remembered it. Vanessa claimed she'd never heard of it. 3 people. 3 different answers. None of them fit together. Before we left the cafe, Vanessa looked at me. "Why are you suddenly asking about old paperwork?" "I was just curious." She shrugged. "Sounds like a waste of energy." Maybe she believed that, maybe she didn't. Either way, I left with more questions than answers. The more I paid attention, the stranger everyone's behavior became. Whenever I mentioned my mother, conversations ended faster. Whenever I mentioned the trust, someone suddenly needed to answer a phone call or change the subject. It stopped feeling accidental. One Sunday afternoon, I decided to ask Patricia directly one last time. She was trimming flowers in the front yard while I helped carry groceries inside. I waited until we were alone. "I've been trying to understand more about Mom." She didn't look up. "I know. I feel like nobody ever talks about her." She clipped another stem. "Some memories are painful." "I understand that." "No," she said quietly. "I don't think you do." I stood there expecting her to explain. Instead, she placed the gardening shears on the porch railing and finally looked me in the eye. Her voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "Elena," she paused. "Let dead people stay buried." Then she picked up the grocery bags and walked into the house, leaving me alone in the driveway with those words echoing in my head. Patricia's words should have ended the conversation. Instead, they had the opposite effect. Let dead people stay buried. She hadn't told me to stop asking about old paperwork. She hadn't said I was imagining things. She connected my mother's memory to that envelope without even realizing it. That was enough for me. I stopped asking my family questions. Not because I'd given up, because I finally understood they weren't going to answer them. One evening after work, I made dinner, opened my laptop, and typed 3 words into a search bar. Family Trust Explained. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. Honestly, I expected to spend 20 minutes reading legal definitions before deciding the whole thing was too complicated. Instead, 2 hours disappeared. I learned that a trust wasn't just another financial account. It could own property. It could protect assets. It could stay active for years, sometimes even decades, depending on how it was written. That caught my attention. Decades. I leaned back in my chair and thought about the envelope again. Dad hadn't called it a trust. He'd called it old paperwork. Those weren't the same thing. The next night, I kept reading. I found articles explaining how trustees were responsible for managing assets on behalf of someone else. There were legal duties, records, responsibilities. The more I learned, the less Dad's explanation made sense. If the document really was meaningless, why had he reacted like someone trying to hide it? At work the following morning, I caught myself thinking about it between appointments. One of my patients smiled and said, "You're somewhere else today." I laughed. "I guess I am." "Family?" I nodded. He smiled knowingly. "They're usually the hardest puzzle." He wasn't wrong. That weekend I visited the public library. Not because I expected to solve everything there, but because I wanted information that didn't come from random websites. A librarian helped me find books about estate planning and family trusts. She pointed to one chapter and said, "This section explains how property can stay inside a trust long after the original owner passes away." I thanked her and spent nearly an hour reading. Every page raised another question. If trusts could remain active for decades, then why had everyone acted as though that envelope belonged to the distant past? By the time I left the library, I'd filled several pages of a notebook. Definitions, questions, terms I wanted to understand better. For the first time, I stopped thinking of the envelope as forgotten paperwork. Whatever it was, someone had made a deliberate decision to keep it out of my sight. That thought stayed with me all weekend. I didn't mention any of this to Ryan or dad, or anyone else. The less they knew about what I was doing, the more honest their reactions would probably be. Monday afternoon, I was finishing paperwork at the rehabilitation center when my phone vibrated across the desk. An unfamiliar number. I let it ring. If it was important, they'd leave a message. A few seconds later, the notification appeared. New voicemail. I slipped my phone into my pocket and finished signing the last patient report before listening. The message lasted less than 30 seconds. A calm male voice said, "Ms. Carter, my name is Thomas Bennett." There was a brief pause. "I believe we need to speak about something your family hoped would never come up again." Then the message ended. I listened to the voicemail 3 more times before calling the number back. Each time, I hoped I'd misunderstood what he'd said. I hadn't. The call connected after 2 rings. Thomas Bennett. His voice matched the one from the message. Calm, professional, older than I'd expected. "Mr. Bennett, this is Elena Carter. I was wondering when you'd call." That wasn't exactly comforting. I stepped outside the rehabilitation center and walked toward the employee parking lot where it was quieter. "You said my family hoped something would never come up again." "I did." "What does that mean?" There was a brief pause. "Before we go any further, I need to ask you something." "Okay." "Did you find an envelope labeled Carter Legacy Trust?" My grip tightened around my phone. "How do you know about that?" "So you did." He didn't sound surprised, almost disappointed. "Mr. Bennett, who are you?" "I was the Carter family's attorney many years ago." Many years ago. Not an attorney. The attorney. That made my pulse quicken. "Were you my parents' lawyer?" "Among other things." I stopped walking. "So tell me what the trust is." Silence. Not because the call had dropped, because he was choosing not to answer. "I can't discuss that over the phone." "Then meet with me." Another pause. "I don't think that's a good idea." I frowned. "You called me." "Yes." "Then why won't you tell me anything?" His voice softened. "Because sometimes knowing the truth comes with consequences that can't be undone." I let out a slow breath. "I've spent my whole life feeling like everyone knows something I don't." "I understand." "No, I don't think you do." For the first time, his voice carried a hint of regret. "I probably understand better than you think." Cars pulled in and out of the parking lot around me, but I barely noticed. Every answer he gave seemed to create 2 new questions. "Were you the one who prepared the trust?" "I can't answer that." "Is it connected to my mother?" "I can't answer that either." "Did my father lie to me?" Another silence. Longer this time. "I think," he finally said, "your father made choices he believed he had to make." Believed. Not the right choices. Just choices. That wording stayed with me. "Mr. Bennett, I'm not asking you to take sides." "I know. I just want the truth." "I believe you." "Then help me." I heard him exhale slowly. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. It sounded less like a lawyer, more like someone carrying around an old mistake. "Ms. Carter." "Yes?" "If I were you—" He hesitated. "I'd stop looking." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was becoming a pattern. My father avoided the subject. Patricia shut every conversation down. Now an attorney I'd never met was giving me the exact same advice. "You're the 3rd person who's told me that." "I'm aware." "You are?" "I've known your family for a very long time." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. He knew them. He knew things about my life that I didn't. Did everyone know except me? He didn't answer. That silence felt like an answer anyway. I looked across the parking lot at people heading home after work. Their biggest concern was probably what to make for dinner. Mine was trying to understand why complete strangers seemed to know more about my own family than I did. "I don't think I can stop." I admitted quietly. I suspected you might say that. So, where does that leave us? For a moment, all I heard was the faint sound of papers moving on his end of the line. Then he spoke one last time. Some promises create more pain when they're finally kept. Before I could ask what promise he meant, the line went dead. I stared at my phone for almost a full minute after Thomas Bennett hung up. Part of me wanted to call him again. Another part knew it wouldn't change anything. He'd made his choice. Now I had to make mine. For the first time since finding that envelope, I considered walking away. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe digging into the past would only hurt people who had already lived with enough regret. I tried convincing myself of that all evening. It didn't work. The next morning, while driving to work, I caught myself thinking about something one of my patients used to say. If everyone avoids the same question, it's usually the important one. He'd been talking about recovering memories after a stroke. Funny how advice finds new meaning later. By lunchtime, I'd stopped debating with myself. If my family wouldn't tell me about my mother's life, I'd find someone who could. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and wrote one question across the top of the page. Who knew my mother before she died? The list started out embarrassingly short. Dad, Thomas Bennett, Patricia, although she hadn't been around very long before Mom passed away. Then I remembered a few names I'd heard as a kid. Neighbors, church friends, a woman who used to bring over pies every Thanksgiving. An older couple who always waved when I rode my bike down the street. The memories came back slowly, not as dramatic revelations, just ordinary moments I'd forgotten. I opened an old photo box I'd kept in the back of my closet. Most of the pictures were from school events or birthdays. A few had names written on the back. One photo showed my mother standing beside another woman in front of our old mailbox. The handwriting simply said, Linda Dawson. Summer picnic. I stared at the name. Mrs. Dawson. I hadn't thought about her in years. She had lived 3 houses down when I was little. I remembered fresh cookies, a garden full of roses, a porch swing that squeaked every time someone sat on it. I also remembered something else. After my mother died, we stopped visiting. Completely. At the time, I assumed life had simply moved on. Now I wasn't so sure. I searched online and found an address with the same last name only a few miles from the old neighborhood. I wasn't even sure she still lived there, but it was a place to start. Saturday morning, I drove through streets I hadn't seen in years. Some houses had new paint. Others looked exactly the same. The closer I got, the more familiar everything felt. Almost like my childhood had been waiting there without me. Mrs. Dawson's house was smaller than I remembered. The rose bushes were still there. So was the old porch swing. I sat in my car for a minute, wondering if this was a mistake. What if she didn't remember me? What if she'd rather not revisit the past? I almost started the engine again. Instead, I got out and walked to the front door. My hand hovered over the doorbell. Then I pressed it. Footsteps echoed inside. Slow. Careful. The door opened just a few inches. An elderly woman looked at me through the screen door. For a second, neither of us spoke. I smiled politely. Hi. I'm sorry to bother you. She studied my face. There was a flicker of recognition. Then her eyes widened. She reached for the screen door with one trembling hand. Wait. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Did you just say your name was Elena? I nodded. Elena Carter. She covered her mouth. Oh my goodness. She stared at me as if she'd been expecting this moment for years. I've wondered if you'd ever come here. She unlocked the screen door without another word and quietly said, You'd better come inside. Mrs. Dawson held the front door open like she'd been expecting me all along. Come in, sweetheart. No one had called me that in a very long time. Her house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. The furniture had changed since I was a little girl, but the place still felt familiar. The same grandfather clock stood in the hallway. The same family quilts were folded over the couch. She led me into the living room. "I wasn't sure you still lived here," I admitted. She smiled. "My children keep asking me to move closer to them." "You never did?" She looked around the room. "This house has too many memories." I understood that better than I expected. She offered me tea, and we settled into 2 chairs by the window. For a minute, neither of us mentioned why I had come. Instead, she asked about my work. I told her I was a rehabilitation therapist, helping older adults regain strength after illness or injury. She nodded proudly. "That sounds exactly like your mother." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "She always took care of people." The answer came without hesitation, even when she was exhausted herself. I leaned forward. No one in my family ever talked about my mother like that. Not Dad. Not Patricia. Not even Ryan, who'd barely known her. Mrs. Dawson smiled as though she could still see my mother standing beside me. She never walked past someone who needed help. She'd shovel snow for the older neighbors before going to work. If someone was sick, she'd show up with soup. If a child was crying, she'd somehow know exactly what to say. Her stories weren't dramatic. They were ordinary. That was what made them feel real. I found myself smiling without realizing it. I've spent years trying to picture what she was like. Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. "You don't have to imagine. You have her smile." I laughed quietly. "I've never heard that before." "Really?" I shook my head. "Growing up, we didn't talk about her much." The room became still. She lowered her teacup carefully onto the table. "That always troubled me." "What do you mean?" "I'd ask your father how you were doing. He'd always say you were fine. And whenever I mentioned your mother..." She paused. The conversation somehow ended. I stared at her. "So it wasn't just me." "No." She sighed. "I noticed the change years ago." I looked around the room, taking in dozens of framed photographs covering one wall. Families, graduations, birthdays, memories displayed proudly instead of hidden away. "My mother's pictures slowly disappeared from our house," I said quietly. "I thought maybe I was imagining it." Mrs. Dawson frowned. "No. They used to be everywhere." She spoke with complete certainty. "I remember one in your hallway, another above the fireplace, and one in the dining room where the sunlight always hit the frame in the afternoon." She remembered the exact locations. I couldn't remember seeing any of them after I reached high school. A lump formed in my throat. For years, I'd questioned my own memory. Listening to her, I realized I hadn't imagined anything. Someone had changed that house little by little. Mrs. Dawson reached across the small table and gently squeezed my hand. "Your mother loved you more than anything, Elena. There wasn't a day she didn't talk about you." I looked away before my eyes filled. No one had ever said those words to me. Not once. We sat quietly for a few moments. Not an awkward silence, a peaceful one, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Then Mrs. Dawson looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "I suppose," she said slowly, "it's finally time." She stood up carefully. "What do you mean?" "I promised myself I wouldn't do this unless you came looking." Without another explanation, she walked down the hallway toward the back of the house. I heard an old closet door open. A few seconds later, she returned holding a small wooden box with both hands. She stopped in front of me and gently placed it on the coffee table. "I've been keeping this for your mother." Then she looked into my eyes. "And she wanted it to be yours." The wooden box looked older than I was. Its edges were worn smooth, and the brass latch had darkened with age. Mrs. Dawson rested her hand on the lid before opening it. "I haven't looked inside in years," she said softly. "I promised your mother I wouldn't." She lifted the latch. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she slowly opened the lid. Inside were only a few things. A small bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon, several photographs, and a neatly folded set of documents inside a clear plastic sleeve. Nothing about it looked valuable. Yet somehow it felt more important than anything I'd ever held. Mrs. Dawson picked up the bundle of letters first. These were written during the last few months of her life. She carefully separated one envelope from the others. She marked this one with your name. My hands hesitated before taking it. The paper felt fragile. Across the front, in neat handwriting, were 2 words. For Elena. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Not because I'd seen it often. Because I'd spent years studying the few birthday cards I'd kept from early childhood. It was hers. I unfolded the letter as carefully as I could. The first line blurred almost immediately. My sweet Elena. I stopped reading for a moment. Just seeing those words felt overwhelming. No one had called me that since I was little. Mrs. Dawson quietly looked out the window, giving me privacy. I took a slow breath and continued. My mother wrote about ordinary things. How much she loved hearing me laugh. How stubborn I was when learning to ride a bicycle. How I'd insisted on wearing rain boots even on sunny days because I liked the sound they made on the sidewalk. They were tiny memories. The kind only a mother would think to write down. I smiled through tears I hadn't realized were falling. For years, I'd worried I was forgetting her. Instead, she had been trying to make sure I would never forget her. Near the end of the letter, her handwriting became slightly less steady. She wrote that she hoped I would grow into a kind woman. Not because the world would always be kind to me, but because kindness was something no one could ever take away. I folded the letter carefully. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like I was searching for a stranger. I felt like I'd just spent a few minutes talking to my mother. Mrs. Dawson gently slid the plastic sleeve across the table. There's something else. Inside were several photocopied legal documents. I recognized one phrase immediately, Carter Legacy Trust. My heartbeat quickened. I pulled the pages out carefully. There were signatures, dates, property descriptions. Most of the legal language was difficult to understand, but one thing stood out. My mother's name appeared throughout the documents. This isn't the original, Mrs. Dawson said. No, it's a copy. She asked me to keep it somewhere safe. I looked up. Why would she leave this with you instead of Dad? Mrs. Dawson's eyes filled with sadness. I asked her the same question. What did she say? She believed your father loved you. She paused before continuing. But she also believed that grief makes people vulnerable. I let those words settle. They weren't accusations. Just fears written years before I ever knew they existed. I looked back at the documents. If these copies were real, then the trust wasn't something Dad had invented. It wasn't meaningless paperwork. It had existed long before I found that envelope. I suddenly understood why Thomas Bennett had sounded so uneasy. This story hadn't started with me. I'd simply walked into the middle of it decades later. Mrs. Dawson reached over and gently touched the edge of the letter. Take both. I've kept them long enough. I carefully placed the letter and the copied trust papers back into the sleeve. Before I could thank her, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, not pity, just quiet concern. Then she said, almost to herself, Your mother was afraid this day might come. I waited until I got home before reading the letter again. Mrs. Dawson had offered to let me stay longer, but I needed to be alone. Some moments are too personal to share, even with someone kind. I made a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table, and carefully unfolded the pages. This time I read every word slowly. There were no dramatic confessions, no hidden accusations. My mother wrote the way she seemed to have lived, with patience, with warmth. She apologized for the possibility that she might not be there to watch me grow up. She hoped I'd never mistake her absence for a lack of love. That sentence stayed with me for a long time, because, if I was honest, part of me always had. Not intentionally, just quietly. When you're too young to remember someone clearly, it's easy to wonder if they would have chosen to stay. Her letter erased that doubt. She described the little things she imagined we'd do together. Teaching me to drive, helping me decorate my first apartment, meeting my future children one day. Dreams she already knew she probably wouldn't get to see. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. Near the end, the tone changed. The sentences became more practical, less like a goodbye, more like instructions. She wrote that she'd made arrangements to protect one thing above everything else: our home. I sat up a little straighter. She explained that the house had been purchased before she remarried. She called it the one place where I should always feel safe. Then I reached the paragraph that made my heart pound. She wrote that she had placed the property into a family trust. Not because she expected anyone to steal it, but because she wanted to guarantee that, no matter what happened after she was gone, I would always have a home. She even apologized for making the legal process complicated. One day, she wrote, "You'll probably think I've made your life more difficult. I hope you'll eventually understand that I was only trying to make your future more secure." I lowered the letter. For years, I'd believed my mother had left me with almost nothing except scattered memories. Instead, she'd spent some of her final months trying to protect a future she would never get to see. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I felt cared for. Across decades. Across silence. Across everything that had happened after she was gone. After a while, I opened the plastic sleeve again and spread the copied trust documents across the table. I wanted to match what I'd just read with the paperwork. Some of it lined up. Property descriptions, legal language, signatures. But something felt off. The pages weren't numbered in order. One document referred to an attachment that wasn't there. Another mentioned a schedule listing the trust's assets. I couldn't find that schedule anywhere. I checked the envelope again. Nothing. I looked inside the wooden box one more time. Empty. Mrs. Dawson had given me everything she had, which meant the missing pages hadn't been left with her. I compared the documents again, hoping I'd overlooked something. Instead, I noticed a line near the bottom of one page. It referred to an original signed trust agreement kept separately with the estate records. This wasn't the complete file. It was only part of it. Enough to prove the trust had existed, but not enough to answer every question I suddenly had. I carefully stacked the pages together, looking from the letter to the copied documents. My mother had tried to leave me a path, but somewhere along the way, part of that path had disappeared. I spread every document across my dining room table one more time. The letter from my mother stayed off to the side. I didn't want to mix something so personal with legal paperwork. For nearly an hour, I compared dates, signatures, and paragraphs. The copies Mrs. Dawson had given me clearly referred to a trust. They mentioned the house. They mentioned a trustee. They even referenced future distribution. But they were still copies, not originals. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my forehead. If this ever ends up in court, I said to myself, would this even be enough? I had no idea. I'm a rehabilitation therapist, not a lawyer. I spend my days helping people walk again, rebuild strength, and recover their independence. Legal documents might as well have been written in another language. That realization pulled me back to reality. For a few hours, I'd been running on hope. Now uncertainty settled in. Maybe my mother had protected me. Maybe she had tried. But if the original documents had disappeared years ago, what exactly could I prove? The next evening, I searched online again. This time, I wasn't reading about trusts in general. I searched for how property ownership is officially recorded. The answers were much clearer. Copies could be useful, letters explained intentions. But official property records were something else entirely. If ownership or a trust had ever been properly recorded, there should be a public record somewhere. That thought gave me a small sense of direction, not certainty, just the next step. For a moment, I considered driving straight to my father's house. I imagined placing the copied documents on the kitchen table. I imagined asking him one simple question: "Why didn't you tell me?" But the more I pictured it, the less sense it made. If he'd hidden this for years, confronting him now would only give everyone time to prepare new explanations. Or worse, time to move or destroy whatever records still existed. I folded the copies carefully and slid them back into the plastic sleeve. "No," I whispered. "Not yet." For the first time since finding the envelope, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was making a decision. I would keep asking questions. Just not inside that house. The following morning, I called the county property records office during my lunch break. A woman answered after a short wait. "County Recorder's Office. How may I help you?" "Hi," I said. "I'm trying to locate historical property records for a residential address." She asked for the address. I gave it to her. There was a brief pause while she typed. "If you're looking for archived ownership or recorded trust documents," she said, "those records may still exist." My heart skipped. They may? If they've been officially recorded, yes. Can I request them? You'll need to come in with identification. Some archived files aren't available online. I thanked her and wrote down everything she told me. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet it gave me more concrete information than my family had given me in decades. I opened my calendar before I could second-guess myself. Friday morning. I had enough vacation hours saved to take half the day off. I requested the time immediately. The approval came through before dinner. I stared at the confirmation on my phone for a long moment. It was just an appointment. Nothing had been proven. Nothing had been solved. But for the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me the truth. I was going to look for it myself. Friday morning, I would walk into the county property office and ask to see the records that no one in my family had ever wanted me to find. Friday morning arrived much faster than I expected. I barely slept the night before. Not because I thought I was about to uncover some dramatic secret. I just wanted clear answers. Something official. Something that didn't depend on memories or old family stories. I arrived at the county property records office a few minutes before it opened. The building was ordinary. No grand entrance, no dramatic atmosphere. Just people paying fees, filing paperwork, and waiting for their numbers to be called. I took a ticket and sat quietly. A man beside me was renewing documents for a rental property. An older couple discussed survey maps. Everyone else seemed to know exactly why they were there. I felt like I was learning an entirely new language. When my number appeared, I walked to the counter. The clerk smiled politely. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'd like to request the historical property records for a house." She asked for the address. I handed it over. She typed for a while, then disappeared into the records room. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a thick folder. "These are the recorded filings connected to the property." I thanked her and took a seat at one of the public tables. The first pages were exactly what I expected. Property tax records, boundary descriptions, routine filings stretching back years. Then I reached older documents. My mother's name appeared. I stopped turning pages for a moment. Just seeing her name in an official government record felt strangely emotional. She hadn't disappeared. She'd existed. She'd signed these papers herself. I kept reading carefully. There it was again. Carter Legacy Trust. This time it wasn't a copy. It was listed in the official recording index. I leaned closer. The trust had been properly recorded years before my mother's death. Every date matched the copies Mrs. Dawson had given me. My pulse quickened. I continued searching for the next filing. I expected to find another document. Something showing the trust had ended, or transferred ownership, or been revoked. Instead, there was nothing. I flipped through the pages again. Slower. Maybe I'd skipped one. Nothing. I checked the index. The same result. Trust created. Property placed into trust. Then, silence. No termination, no cancellation, no dissolution, no recorded transfer out of the trust. I walked back to the counter carrying the folder. I think I'm missing something. The clerk looked up. What are you looking for? I expected to find paperwork ending the trust. She entered the property number into her computer. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. After another minute, she turned the monitor slightly toward herself and frowned. I'm not seeing any recorded dissolution. So, does that mean it was never ended? I can only tell you what's been recorded. She clicked through several screens. As far as these records show, she looked back at me. The trust remains part of the property's recorded history. I felt my stomach tighten. For weeks, I'd been wondering whether I was chasing a misunderstanding, whether grief and old paperwork had somehow become tangled together. Now, an official record was telling me the trust had existed, and nothing in the public file showed that it had ever been legally dissolved. I thought about Dad grabbing the envelope, Patricia changing every conversation, Thomas Bennett warning me to stop. None of those moments felt random anymore. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I'd been avoiding. Maybe they hadn't simply failed to tell me. Maybe they had made a decision not to. The thought was difficult to accept. Not because it sounded impossible, because it suddenly sounded possible. I stood quietly at the counter, still holding the file. The clerk studied me for a moment. Then she spoke in a more careful tone. May I ask you something? Of course. She glanced once more at the property record before meeting my eyes. Do you already have legal representation? I stared at her, surprised by the question. No. She gave a small, professional nod. You may want to consider speaking with an attorney before you take your next step. Rebecca didn't ask that question right away. At first, she just listened. That alone felt unusual. For weeks, every conversation about my mother, the trust or the house, had ended with someone changing the subject, warning me away, or acting like I was imagining things. Rebecca Monroe did none of that. She sat across from me in a small office with a yellow legal pad, reading through copies of everything I had managed to collect. My mother's letter, the trust documents from Mrs. Dawson's box, the public records from the county office. Every few minutes she made notes. Sometimes she circled something. Sometimes she frowned. I tried not to read too much into her expressions. I failed. Finally, she set the papers down. How are you holding up? She asked. I laughed softly. That depends on the hour. That's probably the most honest answer I've heard all week. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. A real smile. Not the polite one I used around my family. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Before we talk about the documents, I need to ask something. Okay. Did you know about this trust before recently? No. Not even a hint? I shook my head. I found out by accident. She stared at me for a second. You were named beneficiary and nobody told you? Apparently not. Her expression tightened. That was the first moment I saw genuine concern on her face. Not curiosity, not professional interest. Concern. She looked back at the paperwork. The room became quiet except for the hum of an air conditioner somewhere above us. Finally, she tapped one of the documents. This trust appears to have remained active. My stomach tightened. I know. What surprises me is what I'm not seeing. What do you mean? Rebecca slid the papers toward herself. If someone legally dissolved this trust, there should be records. There aren't. If ownership was transferred out properly, there should be records. There aren't. I swallowed. She wasn't telling me anything I hadn't already suspected, but hearing it from an attorney felt different. Much heavier. Much more real. Rebecca spent another 20 minutes reviewing property filings. She occasionally asked questions about dates, family relationships, and addresses. Some I could answer, others I couldn't. That bothered me more than I expected. It was strange realizing how little I actually knew about my own family's history. At one point, she looked up. "Tell me about your father." I hesitated. "That's complicated." "They usually are." "He's not a bad man." "That's not what I asked." I looked down. "No." It came out quieter than I intended. "He isn't." Rebecca nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. Because sometimes someone doesn't have to be cruel to cause damage. Sometimes they just have to stay silent. We continued reviewing documents. Then Rebecca opened a county property report and became very still. Not alarmed. Focused. The kind of focus that made me sit up straighter. "What is it?" She ran her finger down a page. "Interesting. That doesn't sound good." "Not necessarily bad either." She turned the document toward me. Several transactions were listed over the years: refinancing activity, financial filings, various property-related records. Most of it looked like another language to me. Rebecca, however, seemed to understand every line. She studied them carefully. Then she looked directly at me. "Elena." "Yeah? Have you spoken to your stepsister recently?" The question caught me off guard. "Vanessa?" "Yes." "Not much." "Why?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gathered a few pages into a neat stack. I could feel my pulse speeding up. Every time I thought I understood the situation, another piece appeared. Another layer. Another question. "Rebecca?" She exhaled slowly. "I'm still reviewing everything." That doesn't sound reassuring. It means I don't want to speculate. I folded my arms. That definitely sounds like lawyer language. She laughed. "Fair enough." For a moment, the tension eased. Then she looked back at the records, and the smile disappeared. I watched her tap the page again. Once, twice, like she was confirming something in her own mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, professional, careful, the kind of voice people use before delivering information that matters. "Elena." I straightened in my chair. "Yes?" Rebecca held up the property report. "Has anyone borrowed against this house?" I stared at Rebecca for a second before answering. "Not that I know of." She didn't write anything down. She just kept looking at me, almost like she was trying to decide whether I truly understood the question. "My father never mentioned refinancing," I said. "And the house has always been the house. Nobody ever talked about it." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened." She turned her monitor so I could see it. Most of it looked like rows of numbers, filing dates, and legal descriptions. I recognized the property address. Everything else might as well have been another language. She pointed to one filing. "Do you recognize this business name?" I leaned closer. "No." "It belongs to a limited liability company." "So?" She clicked another document. "The registered owner isn't your father." My heartbeat picked up. "Who is it?" "Vanessa Hale." I blinked. "My stepsister?" "Yes." "That doesn't make any sense." "I agree." Rebecca opened another filing connected to the same company. "This business received financing several years ago." "For what?" The records don't specify the purpose. She paused. But they do indicate collateral. I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. The house? Rebecca gave a small nod. The address matches. For several seconds, I couldn't say anything. Vanessa had always talked about running her own business. Patricia never missed an opportunity to brag about it. Family dinners were filled with stories about investors, expansion plans, and how proud everyone should be. I remembered sitting there, quietly congratulating her. I had no reason to think the family home had anything to do with it. Can someone even do that? I finally asked. Rebecca folded her hands together. That depends on whether they actually had legal authority. And if they didn't, then the situation becomes much more complicated. I let out a slow breath. This isn't just about who owns the house anymore, is it? No. Her answer came immediately. It hasn't been for a while. That sentence settled heavily between us. For weeks I'd been thinking about childhood, about old photographs, about my mother's letter, about years of silence. Now the conversation had shifted. Money, loans, legal responsibility, people outside my family. The problem had grown larger than I ever imagined. Rebecca printed several pages and placed them in a folder. I don't want you confronting anyone yet. I wasn't planning to. Good. Although I'm starting to understand why everyone suddenly wanted me to stop asking questions. She gave me a knowing look. People become very protective when financial interests are involved. I thought back to Patricia telling me to leave the past alone, to my father's panic over the envelope, to Thomas Bennett warning me to stop digging. None of those moments felt isolated anymore. They fit together. Not perfectly, but enough to make a pattern. Rebecca picked up a pen and tapped it lightly against the desk. There's something else bothering me. I almost laughed. At this point, what's one more thing? She smiled politely before becoming serious again. If this property was used to secure financing while the trust remained active. She didn't finish. You're choosing your words very carefully. Because I don't want to overstate anything before I verify every document. I appreciate that. She leaned forward. But you should prepare yourself. For what? This may not end with correcting a property record. The office suddenly felt smaller. I hadn't come here hoping to punish anyone. Honestly, I hadn't even come hoping to win anything. I only wanted the truth. Now it seemed the truth had consequences I hadn't anticipated. Rebecca organized the paperwork into separate folders. One for you. One for me. One for anything we request from the county. She was already thinking several steps ahead. Meanwhile, I was still trying to process the fact that Vanessa's business might somehow be tied to my mother's house. I looked at the family photo I'd tucked inside my folder. It was the one Mrs. Dawson had given me. My mother was smiling in it, completely unaware of everything that would happen after she was gone. Rebecca noticed me looking at it. She wanted to protect you. I think so. She may have done exactly that. I looked back up. What do you mean? If this trust is valid, it may protect more than ownership. Before I could ask another question, Rebecca closed the last file and met my eyes. Elena, if these records are accurate, the legal consequences may not stop with your father or Vanessa. I frowned. Who else? She answered quietly. Potentially everyone who knowingly participated. I didn't rush back to my family after meeting Rebecca. In fact, I did the opposite. I waited. Not because I was afraid, because I finally understood that once I confronted them, there would be no putting everything back the way it was. Rebecca had given me one piece of advice before I left her office. Observe first, speak second. So that's exactly what I did. I stopped asking questions. I stopped bringing up my mother. I stopped reacting whenever Patricia made one of her passive-aggressive comments. If anything, I became quieter than usual. Ironically, that seemed to make everyone around me relax. They assumed I'd given up. They couldn't have been more wrong. Whenever I visited the house, I paid attention to things I'd ignored for years. Not what people said, what they did. Patricia was always confident when she talked to relatives. She laughed easily. She planned Christmas dinner weeks in advance. She loved acting like everything in the family was perfectly under control. But every time the mail arrived, she sorted through it before anyone else touched it. Anything with legal markings disappeared into her office almost immediately. Maybe she'd always done that. Maybe I had simply never noticed. Vanessa seemed different too. She was constantly checking her phone. During conversations, she'd suddenly excuse herself to answer a call outside. When she came back, she'd smile a little too brightly. "Business," she'd always say. No one ever questioned it. Not even me. Until now. Ryan noticed me watching everyone. One afternoon, he walked beside me while we carried empty boxes into the garage. "You've been really quiet lately." "I've been thinking." "About what?" I smiled. "If I tell you, you'll probably wish I hadn't." He laughed awkwardly. That's somehow not reassuring. I almost said more. Almost. But Rebecca's voice echoed in my head. "Observe first, speak second." So I changed the subject. Ryan looked relieved. He wasn't hiding anything from me. At least I didn't think he was. He was simply caught in the middle like he had been for years. The person I watched most closely was my father. For most of my life, I'd mistaken silence for indifference. Now I wasn't so sure. The more I paid attention, the more cracks I noticed. He startled whenever the house phone rang. He read the same page of the newspaper without turning it. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the kitchen window long after everyone else had left the room. One afternoon, I arrived to drop off medication his cardiologist had prescribed. My father was sitting alone at the dining table. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. The color drained from his face. He answered immediately. "Yes, I understand." A long pause. "No, not yet." Another pause. I said, "I'll handle it." His voice wasn't angry. It was strained, like someone trying very hard not to panic. When he noticed me standing in the doorway, he quickly turned away. "I'll call you back." He ended the call before I could hear anything else. "You didn't have to hang up on my account," I said. "It's nothing." His answer came too quickly. "Everything okay?" He forced a smile. "Just paperwork." That word again. Paperwork. It seemed every secret in my family eventually became paperwork. I handed him the medication. "The doctor wants you taking these regularly." "I know." "You've missed a few doses." I said I know. The sharpness in his voice surprised both of us. A second later, he sighed. "I'm sorry. It's okay." "No." He rubbed his forehead. "It isn't." For a moment, it felt like he wanted to tell me something. His mouth opened. Then Patricia walked into the kitchen carrying shopping bags. "There you are," she said cheerfully. "I was wondering where everyone disappeared to." The moment vanished. Dad leaned back in his chair and picked up the newspaper again. Patricia looked between us. "What were you two talking about?" "Medication," I answered. She smiled. "Good. That's much less stressful than talking about old family history." Neither of us responded. On my way home, I couldn't stop thinking about my father's face during that phone call. It wasn't the expression of a man who didn't care. It was the expression of someone carrying something for far too long. That realization didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't excuse decades of silence. But it changed the way I saw him. For the first time, I wasn't looking at a father who simply ignored me. I was looking at a man who seemed trapped by his own choices. 2 days before Christmas, my phone rang while I was finishing paperwork at work. The screen lit up with one name. Dad. He almost never called me first. I answered immediately. Hi, Dad. There was a long pause before he spoke. His voice sounded tired. Elena. Another pause. I need to ask you something about Christmas. Dad's voice was quieter than usual. Not weak, just careful. I leaned back in my office chair and closed the file I'd been working on. What is it? A few seconds passed before he answered. Are you coming this year? The question surprised me. He already knew I usually came, even if I stayed only long enough to be polite. I hadn't decided yet, I admitted. I'd like you to come. His words sounded almost rehearsed, like he'd practiced saying them. I looked out the window. Patients and visitors crossed the parking lot below, bundled in heavy coats against the December cold. I wasn't sure anyone really wanted me there. I do. He said it so quickly that I almost didn't believe I'd heard him correctly. You do? Yes. Another silence settled between us. Not awkward this time, just uncertain. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Dad? I'm thinking. About what? The right way to say something? That wasn't like him. My father usually avoided difficult conversations altogether. Trying to find the right words meant he had actually decided to have one, so I waited. I've made mistakes, Elena. I didn't interrupt. I know I have. His voice cracked slightly. I should have. He stopped. I heard him exhale. Then a chair scraped across the floor on his end of the call. I'm listening, I said gently. I know. I'm not hanging up. I know. Another pause, long enough that I wondered if he'd changed his mind. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Your mother. He struggled over the next sentence. She loved you more than anything. My throat tightened. No one in my family ever talked about my mother. Not like this. Not with kindness. Not with certainty. I closed my eyes. I wish someone had told me that years ago. I should have. There it was again. Those same 3 words. Not quite an apology, but close enough that I could hear the weight behind them. I've spent most of my life wondering if she would have been disappointed in me. Dad answered immediately. No. The certainty in his voice caught me off guard. Never. How can you be so sure? Because I knew her. His breathing became uneven again, and because before he couldn't finish. I gripped the phone tighter. What, Dad? I need to tell you. A muffled voice interrupted him. Patricia. Even from a distance I recognized her tone, sharp, demanding. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard my name. Then I heard Dad say quietly, just give me another minute. My heart started beating faster. He was trying. For the first time in my life, he was actually trying. I stood up from my chair without realizing it. What were you going to say? He lowered his voice. There's something you deserve to know. I waited. Every instinct told me not to rush him. If he had spent decades staying silent, pushing him now wouldn't help. He took a shaky breath. The house. Before he could continue, Patricia's voice came through much louder. What are you doing? Dad answered too quietly for me to hear. A second later, I heard footsteps. Then the sound of movement. Patricia? I called into the phone. No answer. Instead, I heard a brief struggle. Not violent, just someone reaching for the handset. Elena, Dad said quickly. I'm sorry, I should have told you. His voice suddenly cut off. Then Patricia spoke. Her tone was perfectly calm, almost cheerful. Elena, your father needs to rest. I was talking to him. And now you're talking to me. I think he was trying to tell me something. He doesn't need any unnecessary stress before Christmas. I took a slow breath. Patricia, please put him back on. There was a short silence. Then she laughed softly. Some conversations are better left in the past. The line went dead. I stared at my phone for several seconds. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. A minute later, I tried calling back. It went straight to voicemail. I didn't call again. Instead, I sat there replaying every word Dad had managed to say. He hadn't denied my questions. He hadn't offended anyone. He'd only talked about my mother, about love, about something I deserved to know. For the first time, I believed he had finally decided to tell me the truth. He just hadn't been allowed to finish. My phone buzzed just as I was locking my office for the evening. I expected another patient update or a holiday schedule change. Instead, I saw Ryan's name. That alone was unusual. He almost never called me first. I answered. "Hey, are you busy?" His voice was low, almost like he didn't want anyone nearby to hear him. "I was just leaving work. Can you talk for a minute?" "Of course." He didn't say anything right away. I could hear a car engine idling in the background. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah." Another pause. "Actually, no." I leaned against the wall outside my office. "What's going on?" "I've been trying to figure out whether I should call you." "So why did you?" "Because if I don't, I'll feel guilty." That got my attention. "Ryan, what happened?" He exhaled slowly. "Christmas dinner." "What about it?" "I heard Patricia talking to Vanessa this afternoon." His voice dropped even lower. "They're planning something." I stayed quiet. "What kind of something?" "I don't know every detail." But it wasn't going to be nice. That wasn't exactly shocking. Patricia had spent years finding small ways to remind me I wasn't really part of the family. Still, something about Ryan's tone made this feel different. "What did you hear?" "I wasn't supposed to." He hesitated. "I was looking for Dad's blood pressure monitor." "They were in the kitchen." I only caught part of the conversation. "What did they say?" Ryan took a deep breath. "Patricia said she wanted everyone to finally see where you belong." I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like her. Vanessa laughed. "And then Patricia said she'd move your seat away from the family table." I let out a small breath through my nose. "So, a public performance?" "I think so." I figured. "No, Elena." His voice became firmer. "I don't think you understand. I heard Patricia say she wants the whole family watching." The words settled heavily between us, not because they surprised me, because they confirmed something. This wasn't another careless comment. It was planned. "You don't have to go," Ryan said quietly. "I know. You could stay home?" "I could." He waited. "So, will you?" I looked across the parking lot. Christmas lights hung from nearby buildings. People carried shopping bags. Families loaded wrapped presents into their cars. Everything looked normal. Simple. Meanwhile, I was deciding whether to walk into a dinner where someone had already planned to humiliate me. "I've thought about skipping it," I admitted. "Then maybe you should." I smiled to myself. "You sound worried." "I am. I don't like how everyone's acting." Neither did I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan surprised me. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For all the years I saw things and convinced myself they weren't my business." I swallowed. "You were a kid too." "I wasn't always." "No. I guess I wasn't." There was regret in his voice. Real regret. Not because he had caused what happened, because he had watched it happen. "You don't owe me an apology," I said. "I probably do." His honesty caught me off guard. We talked a little longer, about Dad's health, about work, about completely ordinary things. It felt strangely comforting, like we were siblings having the kind of conversation we should have had years earlier. Before hanging up, Ryan spoke again. "If you decide to come, I'm listening. Just don't let Patricia catch you off guard." A small smile crossed my face. "She won't." "You sound awfully confident." I'm prepared this time. He didn't ask what I meant. Maybe he sensed I wasn't ready to explain. Maybe he simply trusted me. After the call ended, I sat in my car without starting the engine. On the passenger seat rested the brown folder Rebecca had helped me organize. Inside were copies of every document that mattered. My mother's letter, the trust paperwork, county records, notes from Rebecca, everything. I rested one hand on top of it. I hadn't decided exactly what I would say at Christmas dinner, or when I would say it. But one thing became perfectly clear. I wasn't going there hoping Patricia would finally accept me. I wasn't going there expecting an apology. And I definitely wasn't going there unprepared. I picked up the folder, placed it carefully beside me, and started the car. Whatever happened on Christmas Eve, that folder was coming with me. The conversations around the dining room faded back in one by one as everyone found their seats. Silverware clinked against plates. Someone complimented the smell of the turkey. My aunt laughed at something one of my cousins said. From the outside, it looked like a perfectly normal Christmas gathering. I stood near the doorway for a moment, holding the brown folder against my side. Ryan caught my eye across the room. He looked nervous, almost guilty. I gave him a small nod to let him know I was fine. Whether he believed me or not, I couldn't tell. Patricia walked around the table making tiny adjustments that didn't really need to be made. She straightened napkins, moved serving spoons, adjusted candles that were already perfectly centered. She loved creating the feeling that everything was under control. Then she stopped beside my chair. Or rather, the chair that had always been mine whenever I came for Christmas. Without saying a word at first, she rested both hands on the back of it. The room kept buzzing with conversation. Almost no one noticed. Then she slowly pulled the chair away from the table. The wooden legs scraped across the floor. That sound was loud enough to make several relatives look over. Patricia smiled as if she'd just remembered something amusing. "Oh," she said lightly. "We need this seat over here." She pushed it between Vanessa and one of our uncles. Vanessa smiled without looking surprised. That told me this wasn't spontaneous. They had talked about it. Patricia glanced around the room before pointing toward the corner. "There's a folding chair over there." Everyone looked where she pointed. A small metal chair sat squeezed between the china cabinet and the wall, far enough from the table that whoever sat there would barely be part of the conversation. "There's a seat for you over there," Patricia said with a cheerful smile. A few relatives let out uncomfortable little laughs. Someone looked down at their plate. Someone else suddenly became very interested in pouring gravy. Nobody challenged her. My father didn't move. He kept staring at his water glass. Ryan shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. I wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time Patricia had embarrassed me. She had simply found a new audience. Years ago, I probably would have felt my face burning. I would have wondered what I'd done wrong. I'd have spent the rest of the evening trying to earn my way back into everyone's good graces. Not anymore. Rebecca had shown me the records. Mrs. Dawson had given me my mother's letter. The county clerk had confirmed the trust still existed. For the first time in my life, I knew something they didn't expect me to know. That changed everything. Patricia folded her arms. "Well?" she asked. "Aren't you going to sit down?" Her tone invited a reaction. She wanted an argument. She wanted me to look emotional in front of the family. Instead, I smiled politely. "It's fine." She blinked. "I'm glad you're being reasonable." "So am I." Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with her mother. I could almost see them wondering why I wasn't taking the bait. Ryan quietly whispered, "Elena." I looked at him. He gave the tiniest shake of his head, almost like he was apologizing again. I appreciated it. But tonight I didn't need anyone to rescue me. I walked toward the folding chair. Several relatives relaxed, assuming the awkward moment was over. I reached the chair, then stopped. Instead of sitting down, I turned back toward the dining table. The room gradually fell silent again. Every eye followed me. I took the brown folder from under my arm, held it with both hands, walked calmly to the center of the table. No hurry, no anger, no raised voice. Patricia frowned. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. I simply laid the brown folder gently on the polished wood between the serving dishes. The soft sound it made was barely louder than a whisper, yet somehow it silenced the entire room. Nobody reached for their food. Nobody spoke. Patricia looked down at the folder, then back at me. For the first time that evening, her smile disappeared. Nobody moved. The room stayed completely still. Patricia looked at the brown folder like it didn't belong on her dining table. "What exactly is this?" she asked. "Paperwork," I said. Her smile returned, but it looked forced now. "I thought we agreed Christmas wasn't the time for business." "I agree." I rested one hand on the folder. "That's why I'll keep this simple." My father finally looked up. The color had already started draining from his face. He knew. He hadn't even seen the documents yet, and somehow, he knew. Vanessa leaned back in her chair with an impatient sigh. "Oh, come on. Is this really necessary?" "It is." I opened the folder carefully. No dramatic movements, no speeches, just one document after another. I slid the first page toward the center of the table. Across the top, in large letters, were the words, "Carter Legacy Trust." A few relatives leaned forward. One of my uncles adjusted his reading glasses. Patricia frowned. "I've never heard of that." I looked at her. "I know." She folded her arms. "So what exactly are you trying to prove?" "I'm not trying to prove anything." I placed another document beside the first. "I'm simply showing everyone what already exists." The room became even quieter. My aunt picked up the first page and scanned it. "What is this trust?" Before I could answer, Patricia laughed. "It's probably some old paperwork that was never updated. Rebecca had warned me that this would happen. Stay calm. Let the documents speak." I slid another page across the table. "This is a certified record from the county." Another. "This confirms the trust was never dissolved." Then another. "This identifies the beneficiary." Vanessa's confident expression began to fade. She reached for the page herself. Her eyes moved across the lines, then stopped. "What?" She looked again. "No." She flipped to another page, then another. Her movements became quicker. "This can't be right." I finally answered. "My mother's trust never expired." Nobody interrupted me. For more than 30 years, it remained legally active. I looked around the table. And according to every official record my attorney obtained, I gently turned one page so everyone could read it more clearly. "I am the sole beneficiary." The words seemed to echo through the room. Nobody laughed. Nobody reached for dinner. Even the Christmas music playing softly from another room suddenly felt out of place. Ryan slowly lowered his fork. "I didn't know." "I know," I said quietly. "I don't think any of us did." Patricia suddenly stood. "This is ridiculous." She pointed at the papers. "Anybody can print documents." "I expected you'd say that." I removed another sheet. "This one is Rebecca Monroe's legal opinion after reviewing the county records, property history, and trust filings." Patricia's face tightened. "I don't care what some lawyer thinks." "You might." I looked toward my father. He hadn't touched his food. He was staring at the documents with both hands wrapped tightly around his glass. His knuckles had turned white. One of my cousins finally broke the silence. "So," he looked between my father and me. "Does this mean Elena actually owns the house?" I didn't say that. I chose my words carefully. I said the trust is still active. And that's exactly why the property needs to be legally reviewed. Vanessa pushed her chair back. This is insane. Is it? She looked at me with something I had never seen before, not arrogance, not amusement. Fear. Real fear. Patricia tried to regain control. Everyone, please. She's misunderstanding legal language. I calmly picked up the final document Rebecca had prepared. I asked my attorney one question. I looked directly at Patricia. Could all of this simply be an old paperwork mistake? The room waited. I slowly read Rebecca's conclusion. Based on the surviving trust documents, county records, and subsequent financial filings, there are substantial legal concerns regarding how the property has been managed over the past several decades. Nobody breathed. I continued. In my professional opinion, the property may have been used in ways that were not legally authorized under the trust. Silence. Then Rebecca's final sentence. It is possible that multiple financial transactions involving this residence require immediate legal review. No one said a word. My father's eyes closed. Patricia's face lost every trace of confidence. Across the table, Vanessa slowly let go of the papers. They slipped from her hands and landed softly on the table. Then everyone turned toward my father, waiting for him to explain. Nobody looked at Patricia anymore. For years, she had controlled every conversation in this house. Now every pair of eyes had shifted to my father. He still hadn't spoken. My uncle was the first to break the silence. Richard. His voice was careful. Is any of this true? Dad didn't answer. He kept staring at the documents spread across the table. Vanessa suddenly stood so fast that her chair scraped across the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous. She pointed at me. She's trying to ruin Christmas. I looked at her calmly. I didn't bring opinions. I tapped the stack of papers. I brought records. You don't know what you're talking about. Before I could answer, Ryan quietly spoke. Vanessa. She turned toward him. What? You haven't actually denied any of it. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Patricia immediately stepped in. That's enough. She looked around the table. This is a private family matter. No, my aunt said softly. You made it a family matter the moment you humiliated Elena in front of all of us. That surprised me. I had never heard anyone challenge Patricia so directly. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. My cousin picked up Rebecca's legal opinion and read another paragraph. He frowned. It says here the property may have been pledged as security. He looked toward my father. What does that mean? No one answered. Then Vanessa spoke. It was just paperwork. Rebecca had prepared me for that response. There was a business loan, I said. Vanessa looked at me. Her face had turned pale. You don't know anything about my business. I know enough. I removed one final page from the folder. It lists the property used as collateral. Patricia reached for the paper. I gently pulled it back before she could grab it. You've had years to control these documents. I kept my voice even. You're not taking this one. The room was so quiet I could hear the Christmas music drifting in from the living room. It felt strangely distant, almost unreal. My uncle looked between me and Vanessa. Wait. He frowned. If the trust still owned the property. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Rebecca already had. I answered anyway. If the trust legally controlled the house. I looked directly at Vanessa. Then someone couldn't legally promise it as collateral unless they had the authority to do so. Vanessa's breathing became uneven. That's impossible. I wish it were. She shook her head over and over. No. Her voice cracked. The bank approved everything. I believe they approved the documents they were given. Patricia slammed one hand onto the table. Stop this. The plates rattled. You've embarrassed everyone enough. I finally turned toward her. No. I shook my head. I'm done arguing with you. That caught her completely off guard. For years, every fight had been between Patricia and me. Not tonight. I slowly faced my father instead. He still hadn't looked at me. Dad. Nothing. I tried again. Dad, look at me. His shoulders rose with a long breath. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were red. Not angry, just exhausted. I need one answer. My voice stayed steady, but it took everything I had to keep it that way. I don't care about the insults. I don't care about the chair. I don't even care who borrowed money. I swallowed. I just need to know one thing. The room disappeared around us. It felt like we were the only two people left. When Mom created that trust, I paused. Did you know? His eyes filled with tears. I had imagined this moment so many times. I thought I'd feel angry. Instead, I just felt tired. So many years, I whispered. I kept thinking maybe nobody knew. I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation. My voice cracked for the first time. I grew up believing my mother left me with nothing. I looked at him. I believed she never planned for me. I believed I was forgotten. He covered his face with one hand. I'm sorry. The words barely came out. I stepped closer. No. I shook my head. Don't apologize yet. Answer me. His hand trembled. The room remained silent. Even Patricia didn't interrupt. For the first time in my life. She couldn't. Dad slowly lowered his hand. He looked straight into my eyes. Then, in a voice so quiet everyone leaned forward to hear him, he finally said the words I had waited more than 30 years to hear. I knew. He closed his eyes. I've known the truth for decades. Nobody spoke after my father said those words. Not Patricia, not Vanessa, not me. The silence felt heavier than every argument we'd ever had. Dad looked older than I had ever seen him. I thought I was protecting everyone. He said quietly, "Your mother made me promise I'd keep the trust in place until the time was right. After she died, everything became complicated. Patricia wanted stability. We had debts. Then one bad decision turned into another." He stopped and rubbed his forehead. "I kept telling myself I'd fix it before you ever found out." "You had 30 years, I said. He nodded. "I know." There wasn't much left to argue about. No explanation could give me those years back. Patricia finally stood. "So you're just going to believe all of this?" Dad turned toward her. For the first time in as long as I could remember, he didn't defend her. He didn't defend himself either. "I'm done pretending," he said. It was the shortest sentence he'd spoken all night. Some relatives quietly gathered their coats. Others hugged me before leaving. No one really knew what to say. Christmas dinner never happened. The food stayed on the table until it went cold. Rebecca handled everything after that. The next few months were filled with meetings, paperwork, and more waiting than I expected. The trust records were verified. The county corrected the ownership records. The financial questions surrounding the property were handled through attorneys instead of family arguments. Vanessa's business loan became its own legal problem. It turned out the house had been offered as collateral without the authority Rebecca believed was required. That wasn't something I celebrated. It was simply another consequence of decisions made years before I understood any of them. When everything was finalized, Rebecca called me. "It's official," she said. "The property has been transferred according to the trust." I thanked her. Then I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes without starting the engine. I had imagined that moment so many times. I thought it would feel like winning. Instead, it felt quiet. A few days later, I drove to the house. Patricia was already packing boxes. Vanessa barely looked at me. Neither of them asked for sympathy. Neither of them received cruelty. "I'll give you time," I said. Patricia looked surprised. "You don't have to leave this week." She frowned. Why? Because I'm not interested in humiliating anyone. Her eyes dropped to the floor. That was the end of the conversation. Ryan came outside while I was walking back to my car. You really mean it? He asked. I do. They expected you to throw everyone out. I know. He smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in months. I'm glad you didn't. So am I. Ryan and I kept talking after that. Sometimes we'd meet for coffee. Sometimes he'd stop by after work. We never spent much time talking about that Christmas. We didn't need to. Some relationships survive because someone finally chooses honesty over comfort. Ours did. Dad called a few times. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes only 2. He apologized more than once. I never told him everything was okay, because it wasn't. But I answered when he called. That was enough for where we were. Trust, I learned, doesn't come back all at once. Sometimes it only comes back one conversation at a time. The day the house was finally empty, I walked through every room by myself. It didn't feel haunted. It didn't even feel unfamiliar. It just felt different. Like I was seeing the place without decades of someone else's version of the story. Before leaving that afternoon, I noticed the old nameplate leaning inside the garage. Someone had removed it years ago. Dust covered almost every letter. I wiped it clean with the sleeve of my jacket. Carter House. I carried it to the front entrance. The screws fit the original holes perfectly. I tightened the last one and stepped back. For a long moment, I simply stood there looking at it. When I was younger, I thought my greatest loss was a house I believed I'd never have. I was wrong. The hardest thing to lose was the belief that my own mother had left me behind. She hadn't. She had spent her final days making sure I would always have a place to come home to. The truth had been hidden from me. Her love never was. If you've stayed with me until the end, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. If you discovered that a painful family story you'd believed your whole life wasn't true, do you think you could forgive the people who kept that secret? I'd love to read your perspective in the comments.